The late 2000s. What a wonderful era to be alive. We're on the cusp of so many beautiful things. YouTube's just getting started, touchscreen phones are still in their infancy, and comic book adaptations are really starting to take off, like Iron Man and The Dark Knight. Among those comic book adaptations, we have Surrogates, a 2009 Bruce Willis sci-fi action film that I'm quite fond of. But if reviews at the time are anything to go off of, I seem to be in the minority. So what happened? The Surrogates, the comic book the film is based on, was released in 2005 and ran for 5 issues. Hollywood was interested immediately. At Comic-Con 2005, just 2 weeks after the first issue was released, there was tons of buzz from producers. That never led to anything, but fast forward to March 2006, when the 5th and final issue was on the cusp of releasing, and Robert Venditti, the comic's creator, was approached by Max Hendelman, who, fun fact, is the husband to Elizabeth Banks. Max wasn't established by this point, and was only starting up his production company. But that led to him meeting a much bigger producer, Todd Lieberman, who packaged The Surrogates and brought it to Disney. The contract was finalized by August 2007, and within 2 months the screenplay was done. Fortunately for the team behind Surrogates, it was turned in before a writer's strike in November of 2007. This is how Bruce Willis got involved. He was initially a part of a Robert Stone movie that was in preparation for filming, but the writer's strike killed it, and since Bruce Willis now had an opening in his schedule, he signed on to Surrogates. Just like that, there's another project that benefited from the writer's strike. So I guess the total is at 2 now. Along with Bruce Willis, behind the camera it would have the writers and directors of Terminator 3, which I've heard is underrated. Surrogates is set in the far-off year of 2017. Surrogates are remotely controlled androids, and in the opening of the film, we're shown their inception and how they've changed the world. The founder of VSI, Lionel Cantor, initially invented surrogates to help people who have lost the use of their limbs or other body parts. But near 14 years after their invention, everyone is using a surrogate. People look younger, sexier, and more importantly, violent crime drops to near zero, along with a whole other host of social issues becoming non-existent. But with the rising dominance of surrogacy, human-only reservations start popping up around the US. These humans, or dreads as they're called in this universe, are led by the Prophet, whose message focuses on the purity of the human body. I love this premise, and it has a bunch of interesting ideas attached to it, but the film never dedicates enough time to any of them. There is a lot to this world. For example, later in the film, some surrogates are hitting a space bomb. They call it jacking, and it makes the world feel more lived in. But it isn't seen outside of this scene. That's not a unique issue. There's plenty of interesting premises that could have time devoted to it, but are often throwaway. Even the establishment of surrogates takes a back seat to the main plot, which is the police investigation. Outside a nightclub, 2 surrogates are destroyed by a dread with a new piece of tech. After the assault, it's investigated by Bruce Willis's character, Agent Tom Greer, and his partner, Jennifer Peters. They visit the first operator, who's dead in his chair. That's strange, because you can't kill an operator through their surrogate. It turns out the other victim was the son of Lionel Cantor, who was borrowing his father's surrogate. It's surmised by the detectives that they were out to kill Cantor and not his son. Now they must track the weapon and get to the bottom of the mystery. This revelation happens during their first meeting with Cantor, but this is also where Agent Greer lets him know that he also has a dead son. That's the main rift between Greer and his wife. They've been drifting apart because of it, and buried themselves deep into their surrogates just to escape the reality of what's happened. In Greer's first scene with his wife, he laments that they never get to spend any time together as people, and feels that spending time in a surrogate is different. However, as his wife explains later in the film, she's too emotionally broken to leave the house without it. This dynamic is the emotional core of the film, and it does a lot with the small amount of time allotted to it. As the investigation continues, it leads to the VSI headquarters, the company that owns surrogates. Walking through the hall with all the advertisements for the company is great. It really enhances the world building. The detectives meet with the VP of Corporate Relations and 2 lawyers. They do the usual corporate thing and deny any involvement with the weapon or the murders. The detectives then continue through the labs of VSI and into a military operation. Not relevant to the plot, but seeing surrogates in military action is cool. Back at the police station, they find out the assassin was arrested before, but let off, hinting at a further conspiracy. They head to a government facility that tracks surrogates and can remotely tap into their feeds and even disable them. It's headed by a non-surrogate, Bobby Sanders, with other operators assisting him in the detection and prevention of crimes. It's hard not to draw the comparison of this to other post-9/11 films with the commentary on surveillance and the Patriot Act, most notable of which is The Dark Knight. But within this film, it's hand-waved away as they're the good guys, which seems to be the common trend of the time. Although, this isn't a focus of the film, and rather a plot element to keep the story rolling. Maybe you're thinking, what does this idiot know about movies? Well, I made a TV show, it's kind of the same thing. There's a 5-episode miniseries called Midlands Mayhem, available right now on midlandsmayhem.com. It's a comedy crime show, and maybe you'll like it, I don't know, but I want you to watch it, at least give it a go. From this surveillance, they detect the assassin, and a police squad is sent after him. This is a great chase sequence. Lots of energy and escalating stakes, especially with everyone being in actual danger because of the anti-surrogate weapon known as the OD or overload device. During this chase, a bunch of cops get killed. Greer, following the assailant in a helicopter, manages to narrowly avoid lethal damage from the OD by taking his headset off just in time. The helicopter crashes, causing significant damage to Greer's surrogate. However, it's still functional, and the chase continues through a dread zone. This scene does a great job at conveying the differences between surrogates and humans. Greer's surrogate is far more physically advanced than the human assassin, with him leaping between crates while giving chase. It not only highlights the difference between humans and Surreys, but also makes a thrilling chase sequence as the assailant is on the back foot. There's a lot of visual storytelling throughout the film, highlighting the difference between Surreys and Dreads. This is most clearly seen by the look of the surrogates. They've got this heightened fakeness to them, which never goes too overboard. It looks like they've always got perfect makeup and lighting on them. It was so convincing to me that I thought it was all practical. But most of the VFX shots in this film were comprised of digitally touching up people's faces.
Interesting thing about Surrogates is that it has a lot of visual effects. This actually has more visual effects than any movie I've ever worked on. There's over 800 visual effects shots. But most of the visual effects in this movie are people. So you will notice that the surrogate characters tend not to have facial blemishes. You won't see acne or zits on these people because they've all been digitally removed.
Greer loses the assailant because all the Dreads attack him for violating the anti-surrogate treaty that these reservations have. With the assailant taking refuge in the Dread Zone, the Prophet appears in front of him, aura farming. But more importantly, recovering the weapon. The Prophet uses this incident as a way to stir up an anti-surrogate revolution. This information is revealed to us through a newscast and isn't really touched on again. Greer's superior at the FBI, Andrew Stone, takes him off the case. All good detectives need to be thrown off at least one. But he won't receive a new surrogate until he's reinstated. This leads to him having an anxiety attack traversing the real world in his human form. Greer makes the decision not to get a replacement, and stay as a human for the rest of the film. At times, it seems like they speed past a lot of the elements of this world to get to this point, and John Mastow explains why in the director's commentary.
Knowing that you're watching a robot in the form of Bruce, because you've seen the real Bruce at home, seeing this guy, you couldn't identify with him emotionally as much as you could with a real Greer. So I was frankly kind of relieved once we could get to the point in the story where we were able to have his surrogate be destroyed, because then you were left with a real character with a full set of emotions and expressiveness, and you could really engage with him, and that's frankly what Bruce does best.
I'm mixed on this decision. I see it and why you would think that, but in general, I think people are much more attached to faces and bodies rather than if they're a robot or not. I had an issue like this with Altered Carbon. That show has a similar premise with the characters having sleeves rather than surrogates. In the first season, our main character, Takashi Kovacs, was played by Joel Kinnaman. Despite the show having some issues, the part that really worked for me was Joel's performance. But since he was a sleeve/surrogate, he was replaced by Anthony Mackie in season 2, and that's where I lost all my interest. It's nothing against Anthony Mackie, he's a great actor, but I was attached to Joel Kinnaman. Even though they were playing the same character, my brain couldn't square that off, and I had to emotionally reinvest into Anthony Mackie. Thankfully, in Surrogates, they don't have this pitfall, and actors play their robot and human self for the most part. And when there's an exception, it works for the film. As a consequence of speeding to get to human Greer, they leave out a lot of opportunity to really live in the world. Not to say that the pacing of this film is bad, I'm thoroughly entertained throughout its entire runtime, and it balances the slow moments with the high-paced action quite well. The tone never gets too heavy either.
Agent Greer? Is that you?
Yeah.
You look terrible.
Thanks. You too.
There's a lot of things that are there to specifically make me laugh. Like there's way more car crashes than there should be. Especially with the one in the opening that happens for nearly no reason. Also, when characters get into an argument, they can just disconnect from their surrogates, effectively ghosting them. I don't think the filmmakers were trying to make a prediction here, but they bloody well did. The issue I have is it feels like the film doesn't fully engage with its sci-fi premise, and is much more focused on the detective side of the plot. A great contrast to this film would be Minority Report, as they share a lot of superficial elements. Surrogates never has a scene like this.
You're talking about predetermination, which happens all the time. Why'd you catch that? Because it was gonna fall. You're certain? Yeah, but it didn't fall. You caught it. The fact that you prevented it from happening doesn't change the fact that it was going to happen.
We never get into the philosophical dilemma of what it's like to experience the real world without any risk attached, or how surrogacy changes the daily life. The film sits at a brisk 1 hour 24 minutes, not including the credits. And I'm impressed there is this much in the film as we have it. This didn't take away from my first viewing of the film, but there was so much more room to develop these ideas. Now that Greer is in his human form for the rest of the film, the tension continues to escalate. The arguments between Greer and his wife become more heated as he's physically hurt from an altercation just before he meets the Prophet. His partner is assassinated in the dead of night, and her surrogate gets hijacked. Interestingly, this wasn't supposed to be revealed until near the end of the film. However, the filmmakers found it to be too confusing with too many other moving elements, so they retrofitted Peters getting murdered. Knowing this, it's no surprise that I forgot for a brief moment during a later scene that she's being controlled by another person. Greer brings the OD to the attention of the military, who lead an attack on a Dread reservation to recover it, but it's already been moved by the time they raid the location. However, that raid reveals that the Prophet is a surrogate, and is being controlled by Lionel Cantor. That's a great twist, mostly because you can kind of see that the face and the body movements of the Prophet weren't quite human. Straight after this, it's revealed that Stone, Greer's FBI superior, was tasked by VSI to kill Cantor because of his anti-surrogate position causing damage to the company. Greer destroys Stone's surrogate and downloads the information of the assassination attempt by VSI. This contains the Prophet's true identity, and Greer escapes to a car with his supposed partner Peters. In another exhilarating action scene, with some, I'll admit, questionable green screen, Peters, controlled by Cantor, takes the information and tries to kill Greer, which ultimately fails, but leads to our climactic finale, which I have some mixed feelings on. Peters, controlled by Cantor, is holding hostage our human friend at the government surveillance facility. The police and military can't do anything because there's a human in danger. Cantor is hooking up the overload device to the mainframe of all the surrogates to change the world back to the way it was. Greer heads to Cantor's main office to confront him. With the uploads now complete, an EMP is going to kill everyone connected to a surrogate. Cantor and Greer have a brief exchange before Cantor swallows a suicide pill. Greer takes over Peter's body and dehooks the OD, saving everyone. But the EMP will still destroy every surrogate. Greer makes the decision to not abort that process, and every surrogate across the grid is wiped out. The film ends with all the surrogates collapsing and people stepping outside for the first time in years, leading to Greer finally meeting his wife in person again. I really like the decision that Greer makes, opting for changing the world back to the way it was. I'm just struggling to justify the Cantor side of the plot. For one, why does he take the suicide pill? He's got a gun on Greer, and the army will be too late to stop his plans, so if he just does nothing, he'll achieve his goal. Secondly, he's gonna kill everyone? Really? Why isn't he just trying to shut down the grid of surrogates like Greer does? If I were to headcanon it, he would think that people have to die to make using surrogates too risky to ever become a thing again. but nothing like that is ever said. And thirdly, if this is the stakes, the military should just let one human die for the sake of stopping this. I think once the trolley problem hits 1 billion people, it's okay to intentionally sacrifice one. What I'm saying sounds a bit harsh. And those issues are certainly present, but with the pacing of the film, it's much less problematic than you would think. And Greer making the decision to knock off all the surrogates on the grid, along with the following ending sequence, are incredibly satisfying to watch. I have my issues with this film, but overall, I found it quite entertaining throughout. Reviewers, however, were not so kind to this film. With an overall Metacritic score of 45 and a Rotten Tomatoes score of only 37%, it clearly wasn't loved. I think these low ratings are twofold. One, of course, is the lack of depth in this film. One critic review even questions the initial premise of everyone becoming a shut-in. And while that premise is more believable in 2025, the film doesn't interrogate that idea. But secondly, I think there was a lot of films like it at the time. Minority Report was one that sprung to my mind, but a lot of others mention iRobot as well. This led to the film not having amazing financials. On a budget of only $80 million, it only made $122 million, with a reported additional $12 million in DVD sales. Keep in mind that conventional wisdom is you have to make double your budget to account for marketing costs, which means the film was overall a failure. That ended any potential follow-ups to Surrogates. But as I mentioned before, Surrogates was based on a comic book. And how different was that comic from the film? Quite a bit, actually. If you thought the film was too focused on the detective elements, the comic is nearly exclusively about it. It saves all the world building and lore for informational pieces at the end of each issue that fill you in on this world, but isn't directly tied into the story. Also, the whole anti-surrogate weapon isn't in the comic. The detectives are just investigating the destruction of surrogates throughout the city by a mysterious figure who turns out to be controlled by Lionel Cantor. Cantor murders the Prophet, who in this version isn't a surrogate, and incites a race war between surrogates and dreads. His motivation is the same, but instead of killing everyone, he just wants to disable all the surrogates, which he ends up successfully doing by detonating an EMP. This leads to Agent Greer taking the blame for the department, with him resigning. Oh, and Greer's wife? Well, she's actively hostile towards Greer in every scene. Then, after all the surrogates are disabled, she kills herself. Fucking hell. There's a whole host of other changes as well. They're not much alike at all. But I'm definitely favoring the film over the comic. I mean, that ending is just fucking depressing as hell. Just keep in mind that this is the first comic I've read since The Walking Dead when I was 14. Despite all the movie's flaws, I'm quite entertained every time I watch it. But you know what this world really needs? A TV show. In 2009, when this was made, the budgets of TV shows weren't high enough to facilitate the concept. But with the current landscape, doing Surrogates on a television budget is more than doable. They'd also have far more time to dedicate to each of the aspects of this world that doesn't get enough attention in the film. But I'm still happy with what we have. If the IP were to ever get revisited, I'd love for it to get expanded on.